Pat Fitzmaurice is a managing editor for FantasyPros and BettingPros. He's a Milwaukee native, a Wisconsin Badger, a proud dad, and he loves his Packers. Everyone should wish him a happy birthday, too. These are his late round perspectives. Is today your birthday?
It is my birthday.
Okay, now I feel terrible that you're recording an episode
dude.
of Late Round Perspectives on your birthday.
Hey man, it's birthdays don't mean much this time of year. It's a pretty mundane day. It's work and then getting some dinner with the family. I think my daughter's making something for dessert, but yeah, man, don't worry about it.
Well, happy birthday, man. Thanks for spending your birthday with Late Round Perspectives. I really appreciate it. I like to start these shows off by sort of allowing the listener to understand the guest a little bit better, to understand your background, what you've done in your past, how you've become a fantasy football analyst, all that good stuff. You have an extensive journalism background, which I found very interesting. How did you become a fantasy football analyst, aka the coolest, definitely not nerdiest job in the world?
Yeah, this job where every day the morning shave is optional. It's not a bad thing. So, okay, I'll try not to make this too windy, and you can interrupt as needed if you want to drill down on anything. But
Yeah.
so like my buddies and I, when we were kids, we were all like sports nerds and just lived for sports. And I mean, the thing that would like get me out of bed every day was like the sports section of the newspaper. It was still the old school newspaper era, and like running downstairs to open the front door and get that paper and read the sports section was like just nirvana to me. So that sort of cultivated an interest in sports journalism, and I kind of decided early on that I wanted to be a sports writer at some point. And then, as luck would have it, my maternal grandmother got remarried. My grandfather had died when I was really young. And the guy that she got married to was the former sports editor of the Milwaukee Journal and had been the Green Bay Packers beat writer for the Milwaukee Journal during the Vince Lombardi era.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah. So this guy, his name was Chuck Johnson. And, Chuck and I hit it off and, told me some great stories about Vince Lombardi once physically threw him out of a Christmas party. He got yelled at in the Olympic Village once by Howard Cosell. Like, he had these great stories, and he also was like really into, I don't know, he had a way of talking to me about like the English language and like the rules of the road of journalism, and doing it without being in too much of a lecturing way. So I was kind of interested in hearing about all these things, and like there are certain pet peeves he had that soon became my pet peeves. So anyway, yeah, I was on the journalism track, got to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, became a journalism major, worked at the one of the two student newspapers, eventually became an entertainment section editor. And then I was out of college for a couple of years, and I was working at a chain of suburban newspapers, like weekly suburban newspapers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I'm doing like news. And I had this good friend from high school and college who was trying to get me to move down to Chicago. And, back to the newspaper thing, this was when people still looked for jobs in the want ads of newspapers. And he saw one for Pro Football Weekly looking for an associate editor, took the time to clip it out of the newspaper and mail it to me, like snail mail it to me. So I get this, I apply for the job, and I end up getting it. And, so yeah, moved down to Chicago, and I'm working for Pro Football Weekly. And that was my first professional job in the sports media. Now that was like maybe 15 to 20% fantasy.
Okay.
Although fantasy was probably 80 to 85% of what we talked about in the office during the day. But
Sure.
yeah, so it was just more like NFL coverage for this. We called it a magazine, but it was more like a tabloid style newspaper. And so I was there for 2 years. It was a dream job, except it didn't pay enough for me to live on. So I had to leave and take another job in Chicago. And I left on good terms. And one of the higher ranking editors asked me if I wanted to do some freelancing in fantasy football. And I said, sure. So like starting in, God, I think it was 2000, JJ, I started doing weekly fantasy rankings in the year 2000 and
Wow.
writing like a weekly fantasy column. And just, I freelanced for PFW for a long time. And then they went under in like 2013, I believe. So then I'm like all of a sudden homeless for content. And Melissa Jacobs, the owner and proprietor of a site called The Football Girl, like
Yep.
tweeted something upon the announcement that PFW was going under and folding, that she was going to miss it. And she was especially going to miss my fantasy stuff. So I got to thinking, like, a month or so later, I reached out to Melissa and asked if she might want fantasy content on The Football Girl. And, she said yes. And we became content partners. So that's where my rankings and articles would be. And,
Mm-hmm.
Melissa's great. One of my favorite people on the planet. We become really good friends. And I was there until Fantasy Pros offered me a position in 2021. I'd gotten to know some of the people at Fantasy Pros, including, our mutual friend, the late, great Mike Tagliere.
Yep.
And, Tags had become a good friend and golf buddy. And, I was really excited about the chance to work with Tags. This was like, my hiring was pretty much right after he got sick. And the assumption was always that he was going to come out of it. And, I'd get to work with Tags and it would be great. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. He didn't make it. And I don't know, man, we're still trying to soldier on without Tags, but it's like the more time you spend around the people who worked with him and were friends with him, like it just makes you appreciate how special a guy he was. Like
Mm-hmm.
he did have that inner light. Like he was the Pied Piper. People were just
Yep.
totally drawn to Tags. Uh, so anyway, that's the journey. And yeah, JJ, I mean, if you had told me early in my professional career that I was going to eventually leave the world of traditional journalism for a job in fantasy football, I would have thought that meant that I would be like unmarried, broke or nearly broke, and probably living in my mom's basement.
Yeah.
Because, like, what I didn't see coming was that by the year of our Lord 2023, newspapers would be almost dead. No one would read them anymore. And like your aunts would be in 3 fantasy leagues. Like it's been the tectonic plates have shifted in ways I never could have imagined.
Yeah. Do you think that a traditional journalism major like yourself or others in journalism, maybe not so much anymore necessarily, but probably still to some degree, sort of look down on a job like this? Like, do you think that part of that feeling that you feel of, I can't believe this is, where I'm at, I think that, you and I both at this point in our lives feel very comfortable with what we're doing. And,
Oh, yeah.
like you do have those like existential moments though of like, man, I'm analyzing a game about a game for a living right now. And it's a little bit like, am I wasting this in a way, right? Like, am I doing something right now where it's just not that important? I've talked about that on this show plenty of times where it's like, there's doctors, there's lawyers, there's all these professions where they're doing things that can very directly impact the world in that way. And I think that a lot of people in journalism probably feel that way too, where there's this hope to be able to really portray stories and tell stories that people wouldn't otherwise see that are very, very important to the world. And then here we are sitting here talking about, random backup running backs who may or may not play in week 15, And so is part of the feeling that you're feeling of like looking back on your journey that, or is it just more so, I can't believe this industry exists the way that it exists now?
Yeah, it's sort of the disbelief that it exists the way it exists. And now, I mean, there's so many really talented people. Yourself, you're certainly atop that list,
Thank
and
you.
doing like people doing extraordinary work now. So it isn't like, oh, I couldn't hack it as a beat writer for the Cincinnati Bengals, so I'm doing fantasy football instead. Like
Right.
people are choosing to go into this profession,
Right.
and yeah, like I feel like it's been now probably a couple of decades since people were looking down their nose at the fantasy people.
Yeah.
And it's just like the proliferation of this industry has just been crazy. I mean, like
Yeah.
it was just 10 years ago that we were all kind of joining Twitter for the first time. And,
That's right.
all of a sudden, look at us now.
So the other thing I wanted to ask, the other thing, part of that first answer with your step grandpa, if you will,
Yeah,
who was the beat reporter. So you were in Milwaukee. Yeah. And
correct.
this is partially my ignorance, but what is the split in Milwaukee between, like, is the majority of Milwaukee, because you obviously became a Packers fan, but was that sort of skewed because of him, or was it that Milwaukee is just naturally a Packers city? Because isn't it geographically closer to Chicago than it is Green Bay, or is it like split, or is it closer? I could be completely, again, look, I'm from the fake Midwest city of Pittsburgh. Now I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I could be way off here, but I'm curious like what that split is, and if that grandfather of yours was a reason as to why you became the Packers backer.
I was sort of born and raised a
Okay.
Packers
Okay.
fan, and Milwaukee is definitely Packers country, even though
Yeah.
it's roughly equidistant between
Okay.
Green Bay to the north and Chicago to the south. Like it's interesting if you get to the Illinois-Wisconsin border towns, and there you
Sure.
will drive through some of those, and you'll see like Bears gear on one front lawn and
Yeah.
Packers flags on another. So it's a bit of a like more ambiguous fandom down by the state line, but
Sure.
you get north of like Kenosha, Melvin Gordon's hometown, and it's pretty much all Packer fandom up
Okay,
there.
so it's a state thing.
Yes,
You got to stick with
definitely.
the state, which makes a lot of sense. It's very, very logical. I was just curious if there was a more of like a 60-40, 70-30 type split, but it sounds like, cuz I've never been to Milwaukee before. But it sounds like it's very much a Green Bay heavy city. The other thing I always talk about with guests is what their sort of weekly process is like. I obviously am very numbers driven with the way that I analyze the game, but I 100% believe in the people who are very good at watching film and who can weave that into their analysis pretty seamlessly. I try to some degree, because I think it's important to have a little bit of both. But what's your sort of weekly process like? We're ending the season here in the next few weeks, which I think both of us are probably a little bit relieved by. But the season coming to an end. What was this season like for you from just a weekly standpoint of watching games and then analyzing them?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. So I think people should, whether they work in this business or are just avid fantasy players, I think people should try to drink it all in as much as possible. Like, I'm not a film grinder, but I definitely think there is value to watching as many NFL games as you can. And like, heck, some college football too, if possible. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why part of the reason I was sort of, I don't know, maybe overweight on Devon Achane this year was because I kind of fell in love with him watching Texas A&M games, and
Yeah.
Texas A&M games were kind of a hard watch other than Achane last year. But
Yeah.
just seeing that dude's speed and contact balance, like I felt like he could be another Warwick Dunn
Yeah.
type, and it's been fun to see it kind of happen at the NFL level. I don't really use math the way that you do, JJ, but like I do consume a great deal of statistical content. Like I'm, constantly throughout the week living with about 12 different tabs open on my computer
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
various sites. And I know most people don't have the time to do the sort of research that we do because this is our job, but people can consume the work of the fantasy analysts who are doing this, like looking through all these numbers every week and synthesizing the data and trying to come up with takeaways and give it back to people in articles and podcasts. So, I mean, that's part of my process too, JJ. Like I love reading other people's
Mm,
work and
that's
listening to other
interesting.
people's podcasts. And, you know, although I sometimes listen to music while I'm working, a lot of the times I've got other people's podcasts on, your show, the CBS guys, the Yahoo guys, like Chris Harris, like a lot of different. I mean, I'll make the rounds at like 20 or 30 different podcasts now and again, like not very few of them religiously, like every
Sure.
episode, but it's fun to hear different people's takes and perspectives. So, yeah, man, like I don't have the answers, all the answers, not even close. So I really do enjoy getting different perspectives from a lot of different people. And, sometimes their takeaways like seep into my own, like if I think their reasoning is spot on, like I can be persuaded on certain players.
Yeah, that's
Like,
really interesting. That's really interesting because I think that a lot of the people that I've talked to, at least on late round perspectives, kind of go with the opposite. Like for me personally, and this is no shade to any fantasy analysts out there, whether it's you guys at Fantasy Pros or the guys at ETR, or you mentioned Chris Harris, all these different angles that people are coming at this from. I don't really consume other people's content in season only because when I'm working, I have a very hard time focusing on the actual task at hand whenever I have these other voices that are going on.
Sure.
And that's why I mean, my Spotify Wrapped is literally just like instrumental music, like every single year, because I'm just listening to the album Leaf or Explosions in the Sky all day long, while I try to focus on the stuff at hand. So it's really, really interesting. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, for the record. I just think it's really interesting that you're literally in the opposite bucket where you're consuming all of that. I think that that's probably really good from the perspective that you're not letting anything sort of slip through the cracks. Like you believe you do like waiver wire stuff and like a waiver wire column with the guys over at Fantasy Pros each week. And with me, with the waiver wire stuff, I always have this feeling like, am I missing someone? Like, is there someone that I, because there's a lot of players that we're analyzing, right? And so I guess like from your standpoint, if you're getting it from so many different angles like that, you're not going to miss out on one of those waiver wire players whenever you're putting that type of content together. Is that part of like how you're absorbing that info and then sort of utilizing that info?
Yeah, that does help. I mean, like waivers, I've got sort of my own like net system for trying to like make sure that I've got everyone. But just for a lot of things, like I'm definitely convinced by compelling arguments, and I like hearing these arguments.
That's great.
And I know what you mean about like working. Sometimes I'm sort of half listening to a show and I'll like catch part of something and I'll be like, wait, who were they just talking about? Part of a sentence will sort of hook me and I'm like, wait a second, I didn't hear who they're actually talking about. I need to go back and rewind this. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting though. So the season's almost done. Like I said, we're now in the fantasy playoffs. Very fun time of year. A lot of it's nice to like get rid of the dead weight that we had, the teams that we just, we're just dead after like week 4. Now we're just like, all right. Those teams never existed. Do you think there's any big trend, that you saw this year that you think might change fantasy football drafts in 2024?
Oh man. Well, JJ, I don't want to relitigate the case for zero RB, because we could turn this into a 3-episode show if we did that. But, so let me try to phrase this a little differently. The case for emphasizing wide receivers over running backs early in your fantasy drafts, in a nutshell, I think is that high-end running back production often comes from unexpected places. And it's hard to find high-end wide receiver production in unexpected places later in the draft. So let me rattle off, and I've got a note here on this. The preseason ADPs of some of the running backs who ranked inside the top 25 in PPR scoring going into week 14. I'm using week 14 because I wrote something about this and I've been too lazy to update it for another week of action. But so these were the preseason ADPs of some guys who are currently or a week ago in the top 25. Rachaad White, running back 27. Alvin Kamara, running back 28. DeAndre Swift, running back 29. Isaiah Pacheco, running back 30. David Montgomery, running back 31. Brian Robinson, running back 35. Raheem Mostert, running back 40. Now it starts to get interesting. Jaylen Warren, RB 46. Gus Edwards, RB 61. Zach Moss, RB 66. Jerome Ford, RB 69. Kyron Williams, RB 71. So that's 12 out of 25. That's 48% of the guys who were top 25 PPR scores were drafted beyond RB2 range. Meanwhile, at wide receiver, the only guys top 25 in PPR fantasy scoring who had ADPs outside the top 40 at the position, Cortland Sutton, who was barely outside at wide receiver 41, Adam Thielen, wide receiver 53, Nico Collins, wide receiver 56, Tank Dell, wide receiver 74, and Puka Nacua, wide receiver 90. And we both know, JJ, that like Tank Dell and Puka Nacua are complete unicorns.
Yeah.
You just do not see guys, day 3 rookies, have that sort of rookie year impact. Like it's just a Halley's Comet type occurrence.
Right.
So,
Right.
like what you get is what you pay for at wide receiver. And meanwhile, at running back, guys come out of the ether all the time to be like impactful fantasy guys. I mean, where people are racing to pick up Ty Chandler this week.
Right.
And, that he was a complete afterthought in August. So,
Yeah. The other thing too, with the guys you just mentioned at wide receiver, you had Tank Dell and Nico Collins. CJ Stroud is kind of a unicorn too. I mean, he's having arguably, top 5 like rookie quarterback season ever. I mean, I don't know if that's even hyperbole. I mean, he's been that good. And so that's obviously going to elevate those guys. And then Adam Thielen, is now dropping off a little bit. Basically the start of his seasons was really buoying a lot of those numbers for him. Yeah, I mean, the research that I did and that I've done in like the late round draft guide over the last couple of years, and I did this research beyond that too, but it's very clear and evident that your typical RB2, so even if you just, forget about round taken, because the round that these guys go is going to fluctuate based on the draft that you're in, just look at positional rank from an ADP perspective. If you look at RB2s, so I'm talking RB13 to 24, RB2s versus RB3s historically, really not that much of a difference in terms of their actual production, how they end up performing. If you look at how they perform versus ADP expectation, the RB3s are way, way better bets to make than the RB2s. This is where the running back dead zone idea really comes to fruition and why it exists. You can make arguments for sure, I think with like modified zero RB where you get, the anchor RB, whatever you want to call it, where you get like a Christian McCaffrey. Like no one's arguing that Christian McCaffrey is not the most valuable player in fantasy right now, but it's the idea that you're not just going to have the 101 per se. And it's the idea that a lot of these running backs, like you said, are coming out of the woodwork late all the time. And this happens very, very frequently. I don't think that this is going to change. Like, I don't think usually I look at a crazy trend because this isn't really, to me, I think it's one of those things where we might see more of the masses step into zero RB as we go on year after year after year. But this is still one of those things that should be fairly static from like a strategy standpoint, a strategic standpoint, because just logically the way that the game works and the way that the NFL is working, it does make sense to structure your drafts, in that way. And so usually when there is a trend that exists in one year, I overanalyze it almost to see if this is a trend that I can zig when others are zagging, where people are just so reactionary. Look at all the quarterback stuff from, I comped this year's quarterback season to the one that happened in 2011 to 2012, where 2011 had crazy quarterback numbers. 2012, everyone started drafting quarterbacks really, really early, and then they all sort of bottomed out, right? This season, it was a little bit different because of the rushing floor that some of the quarterbacks gave you, but even still, it was one of those seasons where last year was somewhat of an outlier at the quarterback position in terms of how much of a separation we got from Mahomes, Allen, Jalen Hurts. And we saw that shrink a little bit this year. And people are reactionary where we saw ADP rise at quarterback from 2022 to 2023. And so I do try my best to zig when others are zagging, because that's where you can really create these monster teams. But I think you're right, where this isn't even a zig when others are zagging. This is just structurally a smart way to draft overall.
Yeah, we could probably play this game where I rattle off that list of top 20. You got 5 guys who were drafted outside RB2 range like every year, and it would always probably be, I don't know if it would be as many as 12 every year, but it would probably be pretty close to that. One more thing I'll mention, JJ, like for years, I feel like in spring and summer, we have tried to talk ourselves into the tight end position being deep. And then every year we get into the fall and it's like, oh man, tight end's not deep at all. It's just a complete disaster of a position. Now I feel like for the first time in a long time, it's actually like we do have legitimate
100%.
depth.
Yep.
Just this wave of good young tight ends who've been coming into the league. Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, et cetera, et cetera. Brock Bowers is going to be a top 10 draft pick next year and will be a top 10 fantasy tight end. So I think it's going to mean there's less incentive to target guys like Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews in the early rounds of drafts next year. But like, we're probably going to be entering the strange new world, JJ, of the 4th round tight end next year. Like where I think we're going to see a lot of guys. I don't know. I've just tried to sort of mock draft some things and game it. Like I think the fourth is where we're going to see a lot of dudes like Kincaid and McBride and these guys falling. Like fourth, maybe into the fifth.
Yeah.
So and normally like that's sort of that's been like the forbidden zone for tight ends. That's not where you want to live.
Exactly.
But I think that's where a lot of these dudes are going to go next year.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's interesting too. I talked about this with Barons a little bit, but even since talking to Andy about the tight end landscape, we've seen, Travis Kelce not be his dominant self over the second half of this season. And, now we have Mark Andrews and his injury. George Kittle's always been this just up and down roller coaster given the offense and all the other weapons that they have in that offense. And so not only are we getting this influx of young talent, and you mentioned Bowers too, entering the picture, but the high end of the tight end position, the Travis Kelce's of the world, when we project into 2024, I don't know how we project him being, my take can change, just to be clear. We're talking in December right now for a 2024 season, but I don't know how we can confidently sit here and say Travis Kelce is going to be tremendously better in 2024, a year older than he was in 2023. I mean, it's possible for sure, but I don't know how we can confidently say that to the point where I'd be pretty shocked if he's a first round pick next year in fantasy football. So I think that what we're seeing then is this, sort of like what we saw with quarterback, or what we've seen with quarterback before, where once you get enough options, I say this all the time, once the dual threat quarterbacks in particular, once we got 12 of them, or once we get 12 of them, we can wait forever on a quarterback because we know that we're in a 12-team league. We're going to be able to get one of these guys. And if the same exact thing happens at tight end, which, like you said, we get this great influx this year, not just from the rookies, but you get a second-year guy in Trey McBride. Now all of a sudden we're 8, 9 tight ends deep where any of these guys could be a top 2 or 3 finisher. What's the point in getting a Travis Kelce in round 1, even maybe in round 2?
Yeah, and we might there might be enough where it's like 12 guys we're satisfied with, in which case you can wait, and then it probably is silly to take a 4th round tight end.
Yeah, 100%. So now we're in the fantasy playoffs. Are there any mistakes that you think that managers make each year? This is a mailbag question I get almost weekly in December, is what should I change now that it's the fantasy playoffs? Like, do you have a straight answer for that?
Oh, good Lord. Over managing and overthinking. Like, don't change things. Like that's the issue. I mean, people were benching Lamar Jackson because of the bad weather forecast for Rams Ravens. Like, don't do those things, man. Like, weather is more often than not a big nothing burger, and it certainly wasn't that game. I mean, like we saw spiked offensive production in that game. Like that's it. People so want to feel like they are physically pushing their teams across the finish line that I think it causes people to try to like overthink things and come up with rationale and reasoning for making irrational decisions, and pushing up guys and like plucking out strange angles to justify starting Keaton Mitchell over DeAndre Swift.
Right.
Where it's just like, yeah, I mean, like you can probably look at those two in their stat lines and their game film and like spin some sort of yarn where Keaton Mitchell is like the better play, but like really he's not the better play. I mean, just follow the usage.
Right.
And so just don't overthink it. Don't overmanage it. I mean, you can still lose. Things can go wrong. Your guys can underperform, but like getting cute is not the way to go about it.
Yeah, I've gotten the question too about like are you a start your studs person? To me, start your studs feels just like not a real thing. To me, it's just your studs are your best players, so start your best players. I think that there is a psychological component here where, make decisions that you can live with. Be process oriented, and then when you look at it after the fact, make sure that you say to yourself, okay, when I made that decision, it was a logical decision, and that's all I can ask for, But I think that people, like you said, there might be a little bit of an overthinking of even just doing that. And I get the question again about the start your stud stuff. Do you think that's sort of like, I'm assuming your process for start sit is the same in weeks 15, 16, and 17 as it is in weeks 3, 4, and 5?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'm not ultimately a start your studs guy. I generally am going to start the studs because I think the usage the usage and the talent in most cases points you to the studs.
Mhm.
But there can be some circumstances that might steer me away from, say, I don't know, Jalen Waddle this weekend against the Jets.
Right.
Because like it's this murderous matchup where the Jets don't give up much to passing games. The Miami offensive line is kind of like dealing with all these injuries, so Waddle might not be Tua might not get the time for Waddle to do any business downfield this weekend.
Right.
So like for me, Waddle's like a high end wide receiver 3 this week, and though I would consider him pretty close to that stud class, I might consider starting someone who normally I would not start ahead of him. Someone like, I don't know, Zay Flowers or, a player I consider a lesser player, Rashee Rice. I mean, I think Waddle's a much better receiver than Rashee Rice, but I think I'd start Rice this week just because of the headwinds blowing against Waddle this week.
You just mentioned Zay Flowers, and I have to bring up our auction draft at the Kings Classic. When we were battling, Pat and I were on opposite ends of the room, and I gave him a little look when Flowers was up for auction, and that was a fun time going back and forth. And I ended up getting him, but that team, I don't know if you saw this or not. So the scores were tabulated as to who had the best overall score of the 14 teams in the 2 leagues that we played in. I didn't make the playoffs in one of the 2. Only one team made the playoffs in both. Only one person made it in both leagues. I missed out in the auction by 1 game, by 12 points, essentially, to be able to make it in both leagues. And that was the team, obviously, that had Zay Flowers. But I was very, very frustrated because that team has Bijan Robinson. And as much as I tell people, don't let one game, one performance say that that's the reason why, X, Y, and Z happened, to your fantasy team. Bijan Robinson had the headache game, had the sickness game, and it's very frustrating looking back and saying, I would have made the playoffs had we've just known what was going on in that. I could have even benched him for someone else and it would have been better. But yeah, that was a really fun time doing that auction again.
Oh my, that was a blast. I mean, I felt like you came from Charlotte to Canton, Ohio, strictly to put me on tilt at that auction because you were just vexing me the entire time. And then when it wasn't you, it was like you were tag teaming with like, oh man, Ryan McDowell and Eric Dickens were like,
yep.
I forget which player I was bidding on against someone else, and finally they dropped out, and then McDowell and Dickens, who hadn't been bidding on this player at all, after I thought I've just submitted the winning bid, like jump in and wind up taking the guy from me. Hutchinson Brown was in my case. But about that league, JJ, so we do the snake draft and the auction draft. We have these 2 drafts back to back. And at one point through 7 weeks, both of my teams were 1-6. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Like, are they going to even invite me back next year? I'm doing so badly. That auction team, I've won 7 straight games and I made the playoffs.
Okay, so you're the reason that I'm not in the playoffs in the auction league.
Yes. I caught fire in the auction league and squeaked into the playoffs.
Well, I love those stories. I hope that, look, after the Zay Flowers stuff, even though he's going to crush in the fantasy playoffs, I hope that you win the auction league. I hope that comes back. Good karma comes back. You end up getting that W. It would be a great story. It would be an awesome story. So obviously this is sort of team dependent in some way. But another question I get is sort of just bench management and how you handle that during the fantasy playoffs. Are you someone who more so is looking at a look ahead defense in the fantasy playoffs? Are you looking at running back handcuffs instead? Look, I these types of questions, I know there is not one definitive answer, but how are you just generally managing and handling your fantasy rosters this time of year?
Right. You're right about it being team dependent. Because I've got, say, there's one team I have where I just rolled Yahtzee at running back where I've got like Tony Pollard and Jonathan Taylor's not even playing, Achane, Kyron Williams, and I forget someone else. But like I never dealt away any of the strength because I always had like a couple of those guys hurt. And now other than Taylor, they're all healthy. But like I'm not going to get Royce Freeman. Because like Royce Freeman is never going to crack my starting lineup, even if, like Kyron Williams could break his arm and I'm still not going to play Royce Freeman the rest of the way. So, but generally, JJ, I share your philosophy on handcuffing. Like I don't draft handcuffs because I don't want to dedicate 2 roster spots to the running back position on one team.
Right.
It's just like that's robbing you of one chance to strike gold somewhere else.
Right.
with the roster spot. So, but man, like the handcuffs, I do think around Thanksgiving time. I mean, we have a joke about this on the Fantasy Pros waiver podcast, stuffing and cuffing season, Thanksgiving, like that's the time to go out and get your handcuffs if you need them, if it would do you good to, lock down that one team's running back position. So I'm not opposed to carrying a second defense this time of year, especially if the culture in your league is one of hoarding defenses late in the season. I know a lot of people do that. I'm willing to carry a second quarterback in a 1 QB league, something I'm generally not going to do during the season. Same with the second tight end. So yeah, you nailed it in saying that it's pretty team dependent. Basically, I just want to make an attempt to safeguard whatever vulnerabilities my particular team might have.
Yeah, I think the culture thing is incredibly important. I do live Q&As with my Patreon every week, and one of the things that people say is, should I add this other quarterback because, I have quarterback X who has a bad matchup. Should I add this other quarterback off the waiver wire this week? And then they list off the quarterback's names, or they say, should I drop this guy? Let's say they had Jared Goff or something, and let's just pretend Goff has this horrific playoff schedule. And they're like, should I drop Goff for X, Y, and Z? Well, if the X, Y, and Z is Desmond Ridder and Zach Wilson, the answer to that is no, don't do that. And it's also telling me as an analyst trying to answer that question that your league is probably hoarding quarterbacks if it's a single quarterback 12-team league, right? Whereas if they're saying, hey, Matthew Stafford, Sam Howell, and they're naming all these guys who are fringe, Stafford and Howell both this week could be in great spots, but these guys who are just generally high-end QB2s, maybe even fringe QB1s that are sitting on your waiver wire, that I'm going to say, feel free to drop this quarterback who's a mid-range QB2 for those guys, because there's plenty of quarterbacks available and people clearly aren't hoarding them. The exact same logic applies for defenses, right? Where if the Rams are on your waiver wire still right now, if the Bills or the Broncos, what have you, who are in great spots in week 16 and 17, that means that teams in your league really aren't hoarding those positions. And so you don't need to necessarily prioritize that, whereas that running backs are valuable. And if a guy goes down, if Rico Dowdle's on your waiver wire, everyone knock on wood right now because we cannot afford a Tony Pollard injury. But, if Rico Dowdle's on your waiver wire, probably makes sense to just go that route as opposed to stashing the defense. So that's a really good point with the culture stuff. Speaking of stashing, if you had one player that you would stash right now for the stretch run, and this could be injury dependent, it could be anything, who would that one player be?
Well, I had one guy like this, and it was Josh Palmer. And so the whole broken index finger for Justin Herbert really wasn't part of that plan. Otherwise, I think that stash plan would have worked out really well for my lighter teams at wide receiver. Now, man, like just off the top of my head, I'm going to say Chase Brown, just because if now like he is clearly emerged as the obvious handcuff to Joe Mixon and like looks really good. Now, I don't think he has any standalone value right now, even though he made those two big plays in the passing game last week. But like he showed me something. He was a high performer at Illinois when he was there, showed he could handle a huge workload. I mean, like Brett Bielema ran him into the ground his final year at Illinois. So if anything happened to Joe Mixon, he could be the guy who steps in and immediately gets 20 touches a week down the stretch. So like that's kind of a guy I'd want to have. And goodness, if I were the Joe Mixon owner, I would definitely want Chase Brown.
Yeah, something else that I think is really pertinent to the running back handcuff discussion is that if we are analyzing schedules and upcoming outlook for these running backs, like a DeAndre Swift, for instance, he goes back-to-back games against really tough defenses, but their schedule really opens up during the fantasy playoffs, right? One of the things that I talked about on 15 Transactions earlier this week was Kenneth Gainwell, to me, becomes a more attractive handcuff because we know that the schedule for Philadelphia is really favorable. I'm not saying that standalone Gainwell is someone that I want to start, but as a handcuff in that category, I'm going to like him a little bit more. Same with a Tyler Algier type, right? Bijan Robinson has arguably the best schedule in the fantasy playoffs. And if he ends up going down, again, everyone, please knock on wood as hard as you possibly can right now. But if Bijan Robinson were to go down, Tyler Algier, I do think Cordell Patterson would be involved and such, and it wouldn't be as clean, but it would be a pretty great spot for him to be in because the schedule is so nice. So that's another thing to really think about with the handcuff stuff. Chase Brown's a great call out though. I thought that he was a really fun and interesting prospect. The biggest negative for me analytically was his age because he came out a little bit older, but he was explosive. Like he tested really well. He looks explosive. We've already seen him look really, he looks more explosive than Joe Mixon, that's for sure. And so I do think that he's a very, very interesting player. All right, let's move on to some player analysis stuff because there's some interesting stories going around in the NFL, including Cooper Kupp, who all of a sudden had a big outing in a tough spot against Baltimore, but that Rams offense looked good. Are you finally feeling okay about Cooper Kupp? Obviously great spot for this Rams offense this week, but do you think he's going to be super reliable for fantasy squads, in the fantasy playoffs? And I'll kind of throw a follow-up to that and just let you kind of talk about it. But I noticed that at least early on, because I do my rankings and then I compare to FantasyPros expert consensus just to see like where my brain is at versus where the consensus is at. Because otherwise I would have no idea and it helps me give better advice. But I noticed that Kupp was ranked ahead, at least earlier this week. It might have changed by now. And maybe you agree with this. He was ranked ahead of Puka Nacua. And I'm curious if you think that that's the obvious move to make and that Cooper Kupp is the guy that you would rather roster this week and beyond through the rest of the season.
It's funny, JJ. I was just looking at the Fantasy Pros ECR, the expert consensus rankings before the show, and Kupp was all the way up to wide receiver 5 this week. And this was a dude who had 6 straight games with 50 or fewer receiving yards. And then, hangs this unexpected 115 yards and a touchdown on the Ravens, one of the toughest pass defenses in the league, in the rain. So apparently people are no longer concerned about Cooper Kupp, the rankers. But I don't know, man. He does get this dream matchup against Washington, which is like, I think they've given up 9.7 yards per pass attempt in their last 3 games. And their opponent passer rating on the season is 106, which, to put that into perspective, the career passer rating for Patrick Mahomes, who's the all-time leader, is like 103.6 or something like that. So they're just terrible. And I agree that Cooper Kupp is an obvious start. I do have Puka Nacua ranked higher this week, and I've got Kupp at wide receiver 15.
Yeah,
he was still hobbling around like when he would get up after being tackled last week, JJ. Yep. So I'm not convinced that ankle is totally okay. I think it's kind of been an issue for him all season, which would explain the downturn in production before the Ravens game.
Yep.
So I've got Puka higher. I think I've got Puka at like wide receiver 10 or 11 or something like that. So I'm still a little skeptical about Kupp and his health. I just don't think he's physically right.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And look, this is not, both of us are saying start Cooper Kupp this week. I mean, he's in a very, 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 very good spot. But I just find it strange that all Puka Nacua has done is produced, generally speaking. I mean, there's been down games, especially when Stafford either was banged up or they had the backup in. But Nacua is one of, I think it's either 3 or 4 wide receivers at this point who's seen a 20% target share in every single game that he's played this season. And Cooper Kupp just doesn't have, Puka Nacua is what we had in Cooper Kupp from a consistency standpoint. Not when Cooper Kupp had his monster year, record-breaking year necessarily, but Nakua's consistency is just out of control. And so I found it just kind of fascinating that, there was that gap between the two, because to me, I still prefer, Nacua over Kupp. But again, just to wrap this up, I do think that Kupp needs to be started this week just because the matchup is so good. But you're right. I mean, there's still plenty of red flags going on with him in that ankle.
Agreed.
A wide receiver, another stud wide receiver, who is not coming off a great game, and he really hasn't had many great games of late, is Stephon Diggs. And I just got to ask you, what is going on? How is this happening? He scored fewer than 7 PPR points in 3 of his last 4.
Yeah, and over the current 8-game stretch he's on, he's averaging 5.77 yards per target, which is terrible. So of those 8 games, he's had at least 58 receiving yards in 5 of them, but in 3 of them, he's had 34 or fewer. And in those 3 low yardage games, he was getting face time against Patrick Surtain Jr., Sauce Gardner, and L'Jarius Sneed. So 3 of the best cover guys in the league. That's it. He's going up against really good cornerbacks, and they're beating him.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of it right now. So, and now he gets the Cowboys. So he's going to be seeing like Stephon Gilmore and Deron Bland this
Yeah.
weekend. So like another, and I've got him top 10. He's one of these guys, JJ, I just like can't bring myself to drop below, like mid-range wide receiver one in the rankings. And I probably should, like, I should probably have him outside my top 10 this week and like below Puka Nacua. And I just can't do it. Like it's a flaw here, but I think I've got him like wide receiver 8 or something. But yeah, like that's the issue. I think mainly that he's facing these tough corners. He's had this murderous run of matchups, and it's kind of thwarted him.
Yeah, and I don't think that he is in the same boat, when we talked about start your studs, as like a Jalen Waddle, like you mentioned. Diggs is in another tier in terms of talent than a Waddle at this point. And then on top of that, we've seen the ceiling from Diggs pretty consistently, even to start this season, whereas that wasn't really the case with like if we were to categorize studs, maybe you could throw Waddle in that categorization, but that's a pretty broad categorization if you're going to have both Diggs and Waddle in that same bucket. But I do think Diggs is one of those players where if you have a Puka Nacua option or something, that's one thing. But if you're like looking at Diggs versus Zay Flowers this week, would it shock either of us if Zay has more fantasy points than Diggs? No, it wouldn't shock us. But that's probably a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier of what can you live with. And if I'm starting Zay Flowers and he puts up a dud, even though he's been great without Mark Andrews, if he puts up a dud and Diggs goes off and you lose your fantasy matchup because of that, that's going to be a tough one to deal with all offseason.
In the Fantasy Pros Discord channel, I got my first "should I start Stephon Diggs" question last night, and Zay Flowers was one of the other options. I did not tell him to start Zay Flowers. So.
Yeah, which I understand though. Logically, it's like I could see an outcome where Zay outscores him. But again, I mean, we're looking at a projection. We're looking at what you can again live with if you make that decision. And to me, I would still be starting Diggs as well. We talked about Kelce a little bit earlier. He has just not been having the type of season that many of us expected. Is there any reason to believe that this Kansas City Chiefs offense is going to bounce back in some way? I mean, Patrick Mahomes too has been a QB2 basically throughout, most of the season. Is there any reason to believe that this Chiefs offense can bounce back, and in particular with Travis Kelce?
That's the other thing. Like Matthew Stafford versus Patrick Mahomes is a viable lineup thing, and I think I'd probably start Stafford this week.
That's what I'm saying. So that's the thing too, is that with quarterbacks, it's a little bit different because we have a better sense of projection with guys who are touching the ball on every play. We're more accurate with projecting those guys. Yep. So I'm okay with saying, go with Stafford over Mahomes this week. And Mahomes has just not been very good. It's just different when you're talking quarterback versus wide receiver. But I agree. I'm with you with Stafford over Mahomes.
Yeah, and I mean, like with Kelce, maybe it is age related, and I think ultimately, like he's not going to wind up checking in with terrible numbers this year. He's going to be around 100 catches. Yeah. He's going to be around 1,100 yards. He's probably going to finish with 7 or 8 touchdowns. Like in the grand scheme of his career, maybe this is where we look back on it and say, that's where he hit the down slope a little bit. And, it hasn't been a bottoming out. It hasn't been a steep crash. So that's good. I think the issue with the Chiefs right now is that they are just so bereft of wide receiver talent. Like it's a failure of personnel. They don't have any real wide receivers, JJ. And I'm going to include Rashee Rice in that assessment because I don't think he's a real wide receiver. Like he is a guy who they are trying to, scheme up quick touches to get the ball in his hands and let him work after the catch. Like he does not run routes and beat people downfield and get open and catch, passes 8 to 15 yards downfield. Like that's not his game at all. Yep. And they don't have anyone who can do that. They're trying to use Justin Watson as a lid lifter. They've got MVS, who, I'm a Packers fan. I can tell you all about like MVS's travails over the years. Like Kadarius Toney, that's gone terribly. Like Sky Moore, I think we have to call a bust at this point. Like I just so badly want to see the Chiefs draft like Rome Odunze from Washington or Keon Coleman from Florida State. Just like give them a legitimate wide receiver and let him play with Kelce and Rashee Rice next year, and Mahomes will be fine. But
Yeah.
right now they just are lacking that decent wide receiver.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Rashee Rice, I was even still, even if we believe that he's not necessarily a polished wide receiver, I'm still taking the L on Rashee Rice versus where I had him, entering the league. Not from a redraft perspective, but a dynasty perspective. Redraft, I actually had him as a player to target because it was free. He was so late. It didn't matter. The investment wasn't a big deal. But that being said, I do think that there are concerns with Rice still, and you can look at Matt Harmon's work with reception perception, and he's called this out too, where, Rice is great after the catch. That's really part of the reason why people liked him as a prospect, but he's not the most polished wide receiver, in the world. And that's definitely somewhat of a concern. But right now, when there's such a lack of alternative and they're going to force feed him the ball, and at least we're seeing his route participation rise, week over week. It's finally gotten over the 80% mark, which was not the case for whatever reason. You would think that they'd at least try to just get him on the field a lot because, again, the alternatives are so bad. At this point, you got to feel decent about him, rest of season. But I do still question a little bit about what his, rest of career outlook sort of looks like. You mentioned that you're a Packers guy. Jordan Love has a bad game this past week. I needed him this past week in that auction league that we were just talking about.
Oh.
What's going on there? Can we trust him in the fantasy playoffs?
Yeah, I think so. Like, they've got a pretty light schedule. I mean, I know that does include a much improved Chicago Bears pass defense and a Panthers defense that's like much better against the pass than the run. But mostly, like, I think this entire season for the Packers was sort of going to be the success was going to be measured on getting a verdict on whether to move forward with Jordan Love as their quarterback of the future. And I think they've got a pretty decisive, like, yes verdict on that. And like, the numbers aren't entirely great. He's 20th in passer rating. He's 18th in yards per attempt, but like, he's also in his first year as a starter, and they're going to be even the top quarterbacks have some clunker games, and he certainly had one against the Giants on Monday night. Just unfortunate timing for you, JJ.
Yes.
But like, he's not taking a ridiculous Sam Howell-esque number of sacks. He's mobile, but like, he doesn't vacate the pocket too early. Like, it seems like he's generally keeping his eyes downfield and trying to find open receivers, which is encouraging. So like, I think we are getting more good signs than bad from him. And I have been a Jordan Love skeptic, and I'm still pretty positive about him going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the very least, we know, like, if you're looking at this from a dynasty perspective, because I was actually earlier this season in dynasty trying to trade him away after his peak, after like week 2 or 3 or whatever it was, where he was just like dominating, and I called him a sell on 15 transactions and such. I was trying to just get like, first plus for him, and no one bit, but I'm looking back and I'm like, it's not that bad of an outcome, because now I think he at least is going to have that gig in the short term, moving forward. And, if he does improve, then he could become a pretty viable option overall. Speaking of that Packers offense, though, one player that I did like this season entering the year, again, this was more of a redraft take for me than dynasty take, because I had similar questions about Christian Watson, sort of as I do with like a Rashee Rice. Like, it's sort of a similar-ish, like, is he this polished wideout? Is he that strong of a route runner, or is this more of a physical specimen just dominating? Sort of like we saw from Chase Claypool during his rookie season. Did we learn anything from Christian Watson this year? It doesn't sound super promising for him this weekend to be able to go. It seemed like he was getting into a groove right before this last injury. Yeah. But do you feel optimistic about him going into year 3 for him?
Yeah. So I think his profile might continue to be sort of boom or bust because of the way the Packers use him. Like, his average depth of target went from 13.8 last year, which is already pretty deep, to 15.6 this year. And that's even with these occasional, like, Rashee Rice type little hitches that they'll throw to him. So like, they're really trying to take the top off the defense with Christian Watson, and not surprisingly, like, his catch rate is barely above 50%. They're sort of like, hit or miss targets. Like, if they connect, like, he's going to have some really big days, but like, he might also have some 1 or 2 catch days where you are just left high and dry from a fantasy perspective. So like, I just think it's going to be sort of a boomer bust profile, sort of a much taller version of Deshaun Jackson or something like that.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, I mean, I feel like hamstring injuries are going to be part of the fantasy profile too, because now it seems like he's kind of a chronic soft tissue guy. So I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah.
But man, like ultimately though, we've got this really tall, really fast guy. I'm always going to be interested, but it's, I could see him being overdrafted because people are always going to be enchanted by the measurables.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And measurables are something that, when I'm doing my prospect work and stuff, everyone assumes like if you liked player X, I didn't really like Watson as a prospect, but just as an example, if you liked player X and he's athletic, then you must have athleticism in your model and it's weighed to it. No, I actually don't care about athleticism at all. It's usually embedded in draft capital itself if a player is athletic enough. So I agree. I mean, I do think that Watson's season really was just sort of derailed by that early season hamstring injury, and he really just couldn't get right after that. And then, like we said, last few weeks before this new hamstring injury, he was cooking a little bit. I mean, I was starting to feel a little bit better about all the Watson that I had in my redraft teams, and then now, obviously, we're seeing what we're seeing. And fortunately, my boy Jaden Reed, hopefully, will be able to step up and be that possession guy.
You were all over him, man. You loved him, and like when the Packers drafted him, I'm like, well, all right, JJ loves him, so and that has worked out really well. I mean, I'm thrilled with that guy.
Yeah, he's awesome. I think that moving forward, he's going to be sort of the possession guy for them. And I know that they haven't used him totally in that way. They've used him as an extension to the run game a lot recently, partially because of the Aaron Jones issues and the injuries that he's had. But I do think that Reed is very capable of being an 80+ reception player in the league. Like I think that he's a really, really strong player. He can play everywhere too, play both inside, outside. Before I let you go, Pat, give me a player who might really disappoint us in the fantasy playoffs, and then give me sort of a low-key player who might win titles for fantasy managers.
Sure. Yeah, like I don't want to make the disappointment thing entirely schedule related, but like I mentioned it earlier with Jaden Waddle, like the Dolphins play the Jets, the Cowboys, and the Ravens. Mm-hmm. Over the next 3 weeks. So, and they're having these health issues on the offensive line with like Teron Armstead and their center, whose name I'm blanking on right now. But like, I'm never betting against Tyreek Hill, but I do worry about Waddle and Tua down the stretch. And I'm also kind of worried that Travis Etienne sort of has lost a little bit of his mojo. And he has pretty tough matchups against the Ravens and Buccaneers the next 2 weeks. So although if he can get to week 17, if Etienne investors can get to week 17, he gets the Panthers. So a guy I'm excited about, JJ, and this is one of the underrated engines of my auction league team, the Kings Classic, Chuba Hubbard. I mean, he's been the running back 9 in PPR scoring over the last 3 weeks, and the Panthers are starting to give him almost Kyron Williams type usage, like 25 and 23 carries the last 2 weeks, a season high 78% snap share this past Sunday. This week he gets an Atlanta defense that no longer has Grady Jarrett and is not going to be as good against the run. And in week 16, he gets my Packers who can't stop the run. So, tougher matchup against Jacksonville in week 17, but we'll cross that bridge when he carries you into the fantasy championship game.
Yeah, I really like that call. That's a great call. And I love it when stuff like that happens, when there's a reason for stuff like that happening, and that reason being that the coaching staff is totally different now. They fired Frank Reich, and I always like to see how things shift. With Pittsburgh without Matt Canada, we really haven't seen any shift in that backfield. If anything, Najee Harris has gotten a little bit more work without Matt Canada, but without Frank Reich, we've seen this team lean on Chuba Hubbard a little bit more. So I really, really like that call. Pat, it was great to talk to you, man. Let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, this was great, JJ. I mean, the last time we saw each other, I was stuffed into the back of your dadmobile with like 14 other people. I had like 2 people sitting on my lap, lost the capacity for speech. So this is, much more pleasant circumstances. So yeah, people can find me on Twitter at Fitz_FF and be sure to check out FantasyPros.com, BettingPros.com, and the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast.
Thank you so much for hopping on. It was awesome to talk to you, man. And I promise that next time people are in the Dadmobile, it will be cleaner than it was the last time. We had just had a long road trip, and then I took it over to Canton, and I got roasted for having like crayons and markers in the back. And I'm like, guys, I didn't anticipate being your designated driver and having 14 people in the back seat. I wasn't ready to clean this thing for you guys. So I promise it'll be cleaner next time. But anyway, thanks again, Pat, for joining. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for tuning in.